Lavengro by George Borrow, Chapter 1. On an evening of July in the year 1803, at East Dereham, a beautiful little town in a certain district of East Anglia, I first saw the light. My father was a Cornish man, the youngest, as I have heard him say, of 7 brothers. He sprang from a family of gentlemen, or as some people would call them, gentilâtres, for they were not very wealthy. They had a coat of arms, however, and lived on their property at a place called Tredynoc, which being interpreted means the house on the hill, which house and the neighbouring acres had been from time immemorial in their possession. I mention these particulars that the reader may see at once that I am not altogether of low and plebeian origin. The present age is highly aristocratic, and I am convinced that the public will read my pages with more zest from being told that I am a gentilâtre by birth, with Cornish blood in my veins, of a family who lived on their own property at a place bearing a Celtic name, signifying the house on the hill, or more strictly the house on the hillock. My father was what is generally termed a posthumous child. In other words, the gentilâtre who begot him never had the satisfaction of invoking the blessing of the Father of all upon his head, having departed this life some months before the birth of his youngest son. The boy therefore never knew a father's care. He was, however, well tended by his mother, whose favourite he was, so much so, indeed, that his brethren, the youngest of whom was considerably older than himself, were rather jealous of him. I never heard, however, that they treated him with any marked unkindness, and it will be as well to observe here that I am by no means well acquainted with his early history, of which, indeed, as I am not writing his life, it is not necessary to say much. Shortly after his mother's death, which occurred when he was 18, he adopted the profession of arms, which he followed during the remainder of his life, and which, had circumstances permitted, he would probably have shone amongst the best. By nature he was cool and collected, slow to anger, though perfectly fearless, patient of control, of great strength, and to crown all, a proper man with his hands. With far inferior qualifications, many a man has become a field marshal or general. Similar ones made Tamerlane, who was not a gentilâtre, but the son of a blacksmith, emperor of 1/3 of the world. But the race is not always for the swift, nor the battle for the strong. Indeed, I ought rather to say very seldom. Certain it is that my father, with all his high military qualifications, never became emperor, field marshal, or even general. Indeed, he had never an opportunity of distinguishing himself, save in one battle, and that took place neither in Flanders, Egypt, nor on the banks of the Indus or Oxus, but in Hyde Park. Smile not, gentle reader. Many a battle has been fought in Hyde Park, in which as much skill, science, and bravery have been displayed as ever achieved a victory in Flanders or by the Indus. In such a combat as that to which I allude, I opine that even Wellington or Napoleon would have been heartily glad to cry for quarter ere the lapse of 5 minutes, and even the blacksmith Tartar would perhaps have shrunk from the opponent with whom, after having had a dispute with him, my father engaged in single combat for 1 hour, at the end of which time the champions shook hands and retired, each having experienced quite enough of the other's prowess. The name of my father's antagonist was Brain. What, still a smile? Did you never hear that name before? I cannot help it. Honour to Brain, who 4 months after the event which I have now narrated was champion of England, having conquered the heroic Johnson. Honour to Brain, who at the end of other 4 months, worn out by the dreadful blows which he had received in his manly combats, expired in the arms of my father, who read the Bible to him in his latter moments. Big Ben Brain. You no longer smile, even you have heard of Big Ben. I have already hinted that my father never rose to any very exalted rank in his profession, notwithstanding his prowess and other qualifications. After serving for many years in the line, he at last entered as captain in the militia regiment of the Earl of fill in the blank, at that period just raised, and to which he was sent by the Duke of York to instruct the young levies in military manoeuvres and discipline, and in this mission I believe he perfectly succeeded, competent judges having assured me that the regiment in question soon came, by his means, to be considered as one of the most brilliant in the service, and inferior to no regiment of the line in appearance or discipline. As the headquarters of this corps were at Dereham, the duties of my father not unfrequently carried him to that place, and it was on one of these occasions that he became acquainted with a young person of the neighbourhood, for whom he formed an attachment, which was returned, and this young person was my mother. She was descended from a family of French Protestants, natives of Caen, who were obliged to leave their native country when old Louis, at the instigation of the Pope, thought fit to revoke the Edict of Nantes. Their name was Petremont, and I have reason for believing that they were people of some consideration, that they were noble hearts and good Christians. They gave sufficient proof in scorning to bow the knee to the tyranny of Rome. So they left beautiful Normandy for their faith's sake, and with a few louis d'or in their purse, a Bible in the vulgar tongue, and a couple of old swords, which, if report be true, had done service in the Huguenot wars, they crossed the sea to the Isle of Civil Peace and Religious Liberty, and established themselves in East Anglia. And many other Huguenot families bent their steps thither, and devoted themselves to agriculture or to the mechanical arts. And in the venerable old city, the capital of the province, and in the northern shadow of the castle of de Burgh, the exiles built for themselves a church, where they praised God in the French tongue, and to which, at particular seasons of the year, they were in the habit of flocking from country and from town to sing. Thou hast provided for us a goodly earth, thou waterest her furrows, thou sendest rain into the little valleys thereof, thou makest it soft with the drops of rain, and blessest the increase of it. I have been told that in her younger days my mother was strikingly handsome. This I can easily believe. I never knew her in her youth, for though she was very young when she married my father, who was her senior by many years, she had attained the middle age before I was born, no children having been vouchsafed to my parents in the early stages of their union. Yet even at the present day, now that years 70 have passed over her head, attended with sorrow and troubles manifold, poorly chequered with scanty joys, can I look on that countenance and doubt that at one time beauty decked it as with a glorious garment. Hail to thee, my parent, as thou sittest there in thy widow's weeds, in the dusky parlour, in the house overgrown with the lustrous ivy of the sister isle, the solitary house at the end of the retired court, shaded by lofty poplars. Hail to thee, dame of the oval face, olive complexion, and Grecian forehead, by thy table seated, with the mighty volume of the good Bishop Hopkins spread out before thee. There is peace in thy countenance, my mother. It is not a worldly peace, however, not the deceitful peace which lulls to bewitching slumbers, and from which let us pray, humbly pray, that every sinner may be roused in time to implore mercy, not in vain. Thine is the peace of the righteous, my mother, of those to whom no sin can be imputed, the score of whose misdeeds has been long since washed away by the blood of atonement, which imputeth righteousness to those who trust in it. It was not always thus, my mother. A time was when the cares, pomps, and vanities of this world agitated thee too much, but that time is gone by. Another and better has succeeded. There is peace now on thy countenance, the true peace, peace around thee, too, in thy solitary dwelling. Sounds of peace, the cheerful hum of the kettle, and the purring of the immense Angola, which stares up at thee from its settle, with its almost human eyes. No more earthly cares and affections now, my mother. Yes, one. Why dost thou suddenly raise thy dark and still brilliant eye from the volume, with a somewhat startled glance? What noise is that in the distant street? Merely the noise of a hoof, a sound common enough. It draws nearer, nearer, and now it stops before thy gate. Singular. And now there is a pause, a long pause. Ha! Thou hearest something, a footstep, a swift but heavy footstep. Thou risest, thou tremblest. There is a hand on the pin of the outer door. There is someone in the vestibule. And now the door of thy apartment opens. There is a reflection on the mirror behind thee. A travelling hat, a grey head, and sunburnt face. My dearest son, my darling mother. Yes, mother, thou didst recognise in the distant street the hoof-tramp of the wanderer's horse. That's the end of part 1.